The hallways of Westfield High School buzzed with the usual Monday morning chaos. Students slammed lockers, laughed about weekend stories, and rushed to beat the final bell. Among them walked a new face, a 15-year-old girl with dark curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. Jasmine adjusted the straps of her backpack, her eyes darting from classroom numbers to the schedule in her hand. It was her third school in 2 years. Not because of trouble, her dad's career just kept them moving. This time was different, though. Her father had just been appointed as the school district's superintendent, a prestigious position that made him the boss of every principal, teacher, and staff member in town. "We don't need to announce it," he had told her over breakfast that morning, straightening his tie in the mirror of their new home. "You deserve a chance to just be a student without everyone treating you differently." Jasmine had nodded gratefully. She wanted real friends, not people who were nice just because of who her dad was. She wanted teachers to see her work for what it was, not give her easy A's out of fear. Room 112, room 114. There it is, 116, she mumbled, pausing outside the history classroom. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see students already taking their seats. Her stomach tightened with that familiar new kid anxiety. The teacher stood at the front. A tall woman with steel gray hair cut in a precise bob, wearing a cream blouse and navy pencil skirt. As Jasmine entered, the woman's eyes flickered toward her, then back to the attendance sheet in her hand. "You must be the transfer," she said without looking up again. "I'm Mrs. Reynolds. Find an empty seat." No smile, no welcome, just cold efficiency. Jasmine spotted an empty desk in the third row and hurried to it, feeling the curious stares of her new classmates. A friendly-looking boy with glasses nodded at her from across the aisle. "Now that we're all here," Mrs. Reynolds began, her voice carrying a slight edge, "let's continue our discussion of the Reconstruction era. As I was saying on Friday, the period following the Civil War represented a significant shift in American power dynamics." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, revealing a black and white photograph of the 1870s Congress. Jasmine opened her notebook, eager to make a good impression. History was actually her best subject. Her father, with his PhD in education policy with a focus on historical inequities in school systems, had filled their home with books. They'd spent countless evenings discussing historical events and their impact on modern society. When Mrs. Reynolds asked a question about the 15th Amendment, Jasmine knew the answer immediately. She raised her hand, noticing she was one of only 3 students to do so. Mrs. Reynolds scanned the room slowly. "Anyone else?" she asked, though several hands were already up. Her gaze passed over Jasmine as if she weren't there. "No? Well then, Michael, what would you say?" A boy in the front row gave a partial answer. Mrs. Reynolds nodded encouragingly. "That's a good start. Anyone want to add to that?" Jasmine raised her hand higher. Again, Mrs. Reynolds looked right through her, calling on another student instead. By the end of class, Jasmine had attempted to participate 4 times, but Mrs. Reynolds had not acknowledged her once. As the bell rang, she gathered her untouched notes, a creeping sense of unease replacing her earlier enthusiasm. In the hallway, the boy with glasses appeared beside her. "Don't take it personally," he said quietly. "I'm Thomas, by the way." "Jasmine," she replied. "What do you mean?" Thomas shrugged, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Reynolds can be selective about who she calls on, especially with new students, especially with, he trailed off, adjusting his glasses. "With what?" Jasmine pressed. "Nothing," Thomas said quickly. "Look, what class do you have next? I can show you where it is." As they walked to her next class, Jasmine couldn't shake the cold feeling Mrs. Reynolds had given her. Her father had warned her that not every teacher would be welcoming, but this felt different. She just couldn't put her finger on why. What Jasmine didn't know was that the next 6 weeks would reveal exactly what Thomas had been reluctant to say, and it would change not just her life, but the entire school. 2 weeks had passed since Jasmine's first day at Westfield High, and the pattern in Mrs. Reynolds' class had become impossible to ignore. Every morning, Jasmine would enter the classroom with a deep breath and renewed determination. Today would be different, she told herself. Today, Mrs. Reynolds would call on her. Today, Her hand wouldn't hang in the air like an unwelcome flag. But as the minutes ticked by in the stuffy classroom, history repeated itself. 3 hands went up to answer a question about the civil rights movement: Jasmine's, Thomas's, and a girl named Lily's. Mrs. Reynolds' gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Jasmine before moving on. "Lily, what's your take on this?" Jasmine slowly lowered her arm, the muscles aching from being held up so long. She caught Thomas shooting her a sympathetic glance from across the room. When the bell rang, Jasmine approached Mrs. Reynolds' desk with her recently graded paper in hand. A bold C was marked in red at the top, despite Jasmine having spent the entire weekend researching and writing it. "Excuse me, Mrs. Reynolds. I was wondering if you could explain my grade," Jasmine asked politely. "I followed all the guidelines and used the sources you recommended." Mrs. Reynolds barely looked up from her desk. "Your paper lacks scholarly rigor, and your analysis was—" She paused, waving her hand dismissively, simplistic at best. "Could you be more specific? I'd like to improve for next time." Mrs. Reynolds sighed dramatically, as if Jasmine's request was an unreasonable burden. "I don't have time for this right now. If you want to succeed in my class, you'll need to put in more effort than what I'm seeing." As Jasmine turned to leave, she noticed Lily's paper on the edge of Mrs. Reynolds' desk, and a grade prominently displayed next to glowing comments. Glancing quickly at the content, Jasmine realized they had used the same sources and made similar points. In the cafeteria later that day, Jasmine sat alone, picking at her sandwich without much appetite. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas appeared, tray in hand, not waiting for an answer before sliding into the seat across from her. "I saw what happened in class," he said quietly. "It's not right." Jasmine shrugged, trying to appear unbothered. "Maybe my paper really wasn't good enough." "I doubt that," Thomas replied. "Look, this might not be my place to say, but Mrs. Reynolds has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Thomas lowered his voice. "She's harder on certain students. Students who look like—" He gestured vaguely toward Jasmine. "Students who look like me," Jasmine finished flatly. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. "Yeah," Thomas admitted. "Last year, there was this boy, Deshawn. Smartest kid in class, but Mrs. Reynolds treated him like he was invisible. By spring, he transferred out." Jasmine's chest tightened. She'd faced subtle discrimination before, but never so blatantly from a teacher. "What did you get on your paper?" she asked. "The plus," Thomas replied. "And honestly, it wasn't nearly as well researched as yours probably was." That evening, Jasmine sat at the kitchen table with her father. He was working late again, papers spread across the wooden surface as he reviewed school district policies. "How's the new school?" he asked, looking up from his work. Dark circles under his eyes showed how hard he'd been working in his new role as superintendent. "Fine," Jasmine lied, not wanting to add to his stress. She hadn't told him about Mrs. Reynolds yet. Part of her still hoped things would improve on their own. The next day in class, Mrs. Reynolds announced a group project. "I'll be assigning the teams," she said, reading from her list. Jasmine waited anxiously, wondering who she'd be paired with. "Group 5, Lily, Thomas, and Alex," Mrs. Reynolds continued. She went through all 8 groups. Somehow, Jasmine was the only student left unassigned. "Oh, it seems we have an odd number," Mrs. Reynolds remarked, as if just noticing. "Jasmine, you can work alone or join Group 8, though they've already started planning." Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even those who hadn't noticed the pattern before were beginning to see it now. After class, 2 girls Jasmine barely knew approached her in the hallway. "What Mrs. Reynolds is doing isn't okay," the taller one said. "We've seen it happening every day." "You should report her," added the other. Jasmine clutched her books tighter. "Would it make a difference? She's been teaching here for years." "Maybe not," the first girl admitted. "But we back you up. We've all seen it." As Jasmine walked to her next class, a plan began forming in her mind. If she was going to address this, she'd need evidence. Solid, undeniable proof that what was happening wasn't just in her head. Starting tomorrow, she would document everything. The classroom felt particularly tense that Wednesday morning. Mrs. Reynolds had announced a debate on historical perspectives of the Reconstruction era, and students were arranging their desks in a circle. Jasmine had stayed up late researching, filling her notebook with carefully documented points and quotes from historians. This time, she was determined to be heard. "Remember," Mrs. Reynolds said, standing at the whiteboard, "this debate requires factual, scholarly arguments, not opinions." Her eyes seemed to linger on Jasmine for just a moment too long. The debate began with Alex arguing that Reconstruction had ultimately failed Black Americans. Several students nodded along, adding their thoughts when Mrs. Reynolds pointed to them. Jasmine waited patiently, a hand raised. 20 minutes passed. Every student in the circle had spoken except Jasmine. Her arm ached from being held up so long, but she kept it raised. Finally, when Thomas pointed out that she hadn't had a turn, Mrs. Reynolds sighed dramatically. "I suppose we should hear from everyone," she said, as though doing Jasmine a favor. "Go ahead." Jasmine straightened in her chair, trying to ignore how her heart pounded. "I'd like to talk about the economic factors that complicated Reconstruction," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "While many of us know about the political aspects, the financial depression of 1873 had a huge impact on." "That's not relevant to our discussion," Mrs. Reynolds cut in sharply. "Actually, it is," Jasmine continued respectfully. "The economic crash meant that many promising programs lost funding, which directly affected how." Mrs. Reynolds raised her hand to silence Jasmine. "Perhaps in your neighborhood, that perspective makes sense," she said with a slight smirk, "but in academic circles, we rely on established historical analysis, not personal opinions." The classroom fell deadly silent. Several students looked down at their desks, uncomfortable with what had just happened. Thomas's mouth hung open in shock. Jasmine felt heat rise to her face. Her neighborhood. What was that supposed to mean? The implication was crystal clear. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine gathered her courage. "I'm actually citing the work of Dr. William Franklin from Harvard," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "His research specifically connects the financial panic to the abandonment of Reconstruction policies, which historians contradict this perspective." Mrs. Reynolds' face hardened. "Are you questioning my expertise?" "No," Jasmine replied carefully. "I'm asking which scholarly sources present a different view so I can understand the topic better." Mrs. Reynolds slammed her book shut. "That's enough. Your disruptive behavior is unacceptable. Detention after school today." "But I was just—" "Would you like to make it tomorrow as well?" Mrs. Reynolds challenged. The bell rang, saving Jasmine from responding. As students gathered their things, the tension in the room was thick enough to touch. No one spoke, but Jasmine noticed several classmates giving her supportive glances. In the hallway, Lily caught up with her. "That was really unfair," she whispered. "Everyone saw what happened." "Yeah," added Thomas, appearing on Jasmine's other side. "She had no right to talk to you like that." Jasmine clutched her books tighter, fighting back tears. "Thanks, but what can I do about it? It's her word against mine." Thomas looked thoughtful. "Not necessarily. A lot of us saw what happened, and this isn't the first time." "You should record the classes," Lily suggested quietly. "My cousin had a similar problem last year at Jefferson High. The school has a one-party consent policy for recording." "Is that even allowed?" Jasmine asked. "Check the student handbook," Thomas advised. "But I'm pretty sure it is, as long as you're part of the conversation." During lunch, Jasmine found the policy in the handbook. Students could record classes for educational purposes or to document concerns, as long as they participated in the recorded conversation. That afternoon in detention, Jasmine sat alone in the empty classroom, Mrs. Reynolds grading papers at the front desk. Instead of doing homework, Jasmine wrote down everything that had happened in class that day, recording every word she could remember. Then she added notes from previous days, every time she'd been ignored, every unfair grade, every dismissive comment. By the time detention ended, Jasmine had filled 6 pages. Looking at them, a cold clarity settled over her. This wasn't just a teacher being strict or playing favorites. This was something else entirely. As she packed up to leave, Mrs. Reynolds didn't even look up. "I hope you've learned your lesson about classroom disruption." "Yes," Jasmine replied quietly. But the lesson she'd learned wasn't what Mrs. Reynolds thought. She'd learned that sometimes you had to stand up for yourself, even against people with power. "And starting tomorrow, she'd have evidence no one could deny. Jasmine started her day earlier than usual, sitting at her kitchen table with a brand new notebook. On the first page, she wrote evidence log in neat letters. Below that, she added the date and time of each incident she could remember from the past 3 weeks. Her father had already left for work. These days, he was gone before sunrise and back after dinner, the responsibilities of being superintendent keeping him busier than ever. At school, Jasmine slipped her phone into her jacket pocket, the voice recorder app ready to go. Her stomach felt tied in knots as she approached Mrs. Reynolds' classroom. "You okay?" Thomas asked, catching up with her in the hallway. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad." "Just nervous," Jasmine admitted. "What if she catches me recording?" "Keep your phone in your pocket. She'll never know." He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Lily and I talked about what happened yesterday. We want to help." "How?" "We'll back you up. Write down what we see too. Between the 3 of us, we can document everything." In class, Jasmine pressed record just before Mrs. Reynolds began speaking. Today's topic was the civil rights movement, ironically fitting, given what was happening. When Mrs. Reynolds asked a question about Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategy of nonviolent resistance, Jasmine raised her hand along with several others. True to form, Mrs. Reynolds called on everyone but her. On the 4th question, when Jasmine was again ignored despite being the only student with a raised hand, Thomas spoke up. "Mrs. Reynolds, I think Jasmine has been trying to answer for a while." The teacher's eyes narrowed. "I decide who speaks in my classroom, Thomas. 5 points off your participation grade for interrupting." After class, Lily passed Jasmine a folded note. Inside was a detailed account of what had happened, with times noted. "For your records," she whispered. By week's end, Jasmine's evidence log had grown thick with entries. Not just her own observations, but notes from Thomas, Lily, and 2 other students who had quietly joined their effort. She had recordings of 6 separate classes, each one capturing Mrs. Reynolds' dismissive tone when addressing Jasmine, the way she overlooked her raised hand, and the stark difference in how she treated other students. What she didn't have was anyone with real authority to show it to. Not yet. At home, Jasmine tried to act normal, but her father noticed the change in her behavior. "You're quiet these days," he said one night as they ate takeout dinner. His schedule didn't allow for much cooking anymore. "Everything okay at school?" Jasmine pushed her food around her plate. "It's fine, just adjusting." "Your grades look good," he noted. "Except history, that's usually your best subject." "The teacher's tough," Jasmine said, not meeting his eyes. Her father set down his fork. "Tough is one thing. Unfair is another. Is something happening I should know about?" For a moment, Jasmine considered telling him everything. But what would happen then? He'd march into school as her father, or worse, as the superintendent, and Mrs. Reynolds would deny everything. Without her evidence being complete, it would just be her word against a teacher who'd been there for years. "I'm handling it," she said finally. "I promise I'll tell you if it becomes something bigger." He didn't look convinced, but he respected her enough not to push. The next day, Jasmine was called to the counselor's office during lunch. Dr. Hernandez, a kind-faced woman with salt and pepper hair, looked concerned as Jasmine took a seat. "I've been reviewing student records," she began, and something caught my attention. "You have straight A's in every subject except history, where you're getting a C. That's unusual, especially since your previous school records show history was your strongest subject." Jasmine stared at her hands. "I'm trying my best." "I'm sure you are," Dr. Hernandez said gently. "That's what makes it so puzzling. Is there something going on in Mrs. Reynolds' class I should be aware of?" Jasmine looked up, meeting the counselor's eyes. Here was someone with authority who had noticed the problem on her own. Someone who might actually listen. "Yes," Jasmine said quietly, "and I can prove it." She reached into her backpack and pulled out her evidence log, placing it on the desk between them. "It's all in here. And I have recordings too." Dr. Hernandez's expression turned serious as she opened the notebook and began to read. The school gymnasium buzzed with activity as Parents' Night got underway. Tables lined the perimeter, each staffed by teachers ready to meet with families. Jasmine stood by the entrance, nervously shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "He's late," she muttered, checking her phone again. Her father had promised to come straight from work, but that had been 40 minutes ago. Dr. Hernandez had reviewed all of Jasmine's evidence and recordings over the past week. She'd appeared troubled but cautious. "This is serious," she told Jasmine. "I need to follow proper channels. In the meantime, Parents' Night is coming up. Your father should definitely attend." The main doors swung open, and Jasmine's father hurried in, still wearing his work suit, looking slightly disheveled after a long day. He'd left his superintendent name badge at the office. Tonight, he was just Jasmine's dad. "Sorry I'm late," he said, giving her a quick hug. "Budget meeting ran over. Which teachers should we see first?" Jasmine took a deep breath. "Mrs. Reynolds, my history teacher." They made their way through the crowd to Mrs. Reynolds' table. She was speaking with another parent, her voice pleasant and professional. When she finished, she looked up to see who was next. Her eyes landed first on Jasmine, then slid to her father. Something flickered across her face, surprise, followed by something else. Wariness. "You must be Jasmine's father," Mrs. Reynolds said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Patricia Reynolds. So nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," he replied, shaking her hand. "I understand Jasmine is having some challenges in your class." Mrs. Reynolds' demeanor immediately shifted. Her smile grew wider, more genuine. "Oh, she's been showing improvement lately. Much more potential than I initially thought." Jasmine stared in disbelief. Just yesterday, Mrs. Reynolds had returned another C paper with barely any feedback. "That's interesting," her father said. "Her grades don't reflect this improvement you're seeing." "Well, she started from behind, transferring mid-semester," Mrs. Reynolds explained smoothly. "But I see great things ahead. With the right guidance, of course." As they continued talking, Jasmine noticed Mrs. Reynolds repeatedly glancing at her father's well-tailored suit, his polished shoes, the way he spoke, articulate and educated. Something was changing in the teacher's assessment right before her eyes. "I'd be happy to provide some extra help after school," Mrs. Reynolds offered, her tone almost eager now. "I do this for promising students who need a little boost." Jasmine felt sick. 3 weeks of being ignored and belittled, and suddenly she was promising. All because her father showed up in a nice suit. "Thank you for the offer," her father said. "We'll consider it." As they walked away to visit other teachers, Mrs. Reynolds turned to a colleague at the next table. Neither noticed Mr. Chen, a parent volunteer who was helping with refreshments, standing nearby. "You know how it is with these affirmative action families," Mrs. Reynolds said in a low voice. "The parents show up expecting special treatment. Did you see that suit? Probably the first one he's ever owned." Mr. Chen's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. He glanced toward Jasmine and her father, then back to Mrs. Reynolds. Quietly, he pulled out his phone and pretended to check messages while actually hitting record. Later, as families began filing out, Mr. Chen approached Jasmine in the hallway. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I'm Anthony Chen, David's dad. I heard something tonight that you should know about." He explained what Mrs. Reynolds had said and offered to send Jasmine the recording. "I know what it's like," he said. "My son went through something similar last year with another teacher. No one should have to deal with that." That night, Jasmine sat on her bed staring at her phone, Mr. Chen's recording playing for the third time. Each replay made her stomach clench tighter. Her father knocked gently on her door. "Can I come in?" he asked. "I want to talk about tonight." Jasmine quickly locked her phone. "Sure." He sat on the edge of her bed. "Something's not right with that history teacher. The way she talked about you was inconsistent, like she was putting on a show." Jasmine looked down at her hands. Everything in her wanted to tell him the truth now, show him the recording, the evidence log, the class recordings. But a tiny voice held her back. What if it made things worse? "Dad, if something was really wrong at school, would you trust me to handle it the right way?" He studied her face. "I always trust you, Jasmine. But you don't have to handle everything alone. That's what I'm here for." She nodded slowly. "I have something to show you. But not tonight, tomorrow. I need to make sure I have everything in order first." What Jasmine didn't know was that Dr. Hernandez had already scheduled a meeting with the principal for the next morning. And she wasn't the only one with concerns about Mrs. Reynolds. The next morning, Jasmine walked through the school hallway with her evidence folder clutched tightly to her chest. Inside was everything: her detailed log, printed screenshots of text messages from classmates, and a USB drive with all the recordings, including the one Mr. Chen had sent her last night. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Last night she'd finally shown her father everything. He had listened silently, his face growing more serious with each recording, each page of documentation. When she finished, he had simply hugged her and said, "You've handled this with more maturity than most adults would. I'm proud of you." This morning, he'd driven her to school, but said he had an early meeting at the district office. "Text me when you're done talking to the principal," he told her. "I'll be nearby." Now, approaching the principal's office, Jasmine took a deep breath. She could do this. She had proof. They would have to listen. Ms. Rivera, the school secretary, looked up as Jasmine entered. "Jasmine, the principal is expecting you." "Go right in." Pushing open the heavy door, Jasmine froze at the threshold. Sitting in the office were not only Principal Wilson and Dr. Hernandez, but her father as well. He was wearing a different suit than this morning, with his superintendent name badge clearly visible. "Dad, what are you?" "Come in, Jasmine," Principal Wilson said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Your father is here in his official capacity. We have some matters to discuss." Confused, Jasmine took a seat next to Dr. Hernandez, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Before we begin," Principal Wilson explained, "you should know that Dr. Hernandez brought some serious concerns to my attention yesterday about Mrs. Reynolds. Then this morning, another teacher came forward with similar observations. Ms. Thompson from the English department," her father added. "She's witnessed several troubling interactions." "So you already know?" Jasmine asked, clutching her folder. "We know there's a problem," Principal Wilson said. "But what we don't have is the kind of documentation you've apparently been gathering." Dr. Hernandez mentioned recordings. Jasmine nodded, beginning to open her folder when the door opened again. Mrs. Reynolds walked in, her usual confident expression faltering slightly at the sight of so many people. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Wilson. I have a class in 10 minutes, so—" Her words died as her gaze landed on Jasmine, then shifted to Jasmine's father. Her eyes widened as she noticed his name badge for the first time. "Superintendent Johnson," she stammered. "I don't understand." The color drained from her face as realization dawned. Jasmine Johnson. Superintendent Johnson. The connection she'd never made. "Please have a seat, Mrs. Reynolds," Principal Wilson said firmly. "Miss Thompson will cover your next class." For a moment, it seemed like Mrs. Reynolds might refuse. Then stiffly, she sat in the remaining chair, as far from Jasmine as possible. Jasmine's father leaned forward, his expression calm but serious. "Mrs. Reynolds, before I am a superintendent, I am a father, and we need to discuss what's been happening to my daughter in your classroom." "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Mrs. Reynolds began, her voice higher than usual. "Jasmine is a good student who's been struggling to adjust." "We have recordings," Jasmine interrupted quietly, surprising herself with her own boldness. She placed the USB drive on the desk. "Of your classes. Of what you said at Parents' Night about affirmative action families. Of everything." Mrs. Reynolds' face contorted. "You recorded me. That's against school policy." "Actually," Dr. Hernandez interjected, "our district has a one-party consent policy for recording. As long as Jasmine was part of the conversation, she was within her rights." Principal Wilson picked up the USB drive. "Mrs. Reynolds, these are serious allegations. Discrimination based on race goes against everything this school stands for." "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Reynolds snapped, her composure cracking. "Just because she can't handle the rigorous standards I set." "The same standards that don't seem to apply to my white classmates?" Jasmine asked, pulling out her evidence log. "I have documentation showing how you grade identical work differently depending on who submits it." Mrs. Reynolds turned to Jasmine's father, her tone suddenly pleading. "Superintendent Johnson, surely you understand the pressures teachers are under. Academic standards must be maintained, regardless of background." The room fell silent. The implication hung in the air, making her prejudice even more obvious. Jasmine's father's expression remained unchanged. "Yes, Mrs. Reynolds, standards are important, including ethical ones. Let's review the evidence together, shall we? As Principal Wilson inserted the USB drive into his computer, Jasmine finally allowed herself to breathe. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, the truth was finally coming out. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the principal's office. The hallways buzzed with whispers as students noticed Mrs. Reynolds' sudden absence. A substitute teacher had taken over her classes with no explanation from the administration. Jasmine sat in the cafeteria with Thomas and Lily, picking at her lunch. Despite the outcome, she couldn't help feeling a mix of emotions, relief that she'd been heard, but also a strange sense of guilt. "You did the right thing," Thomas said, noticing her quietness. "My cousin had Mrs. Reynolds last year. She made him hate history so much he almost didn't graduate." Lily nodded. "I heard she's been doing this for years. You're just the first one who had enough proof to make people listen." The PA system crackled. "Jasmine Johnson, please report to the conference room." Her friends gave her encouraging looks as she gathered her things. "Let us know what happens," Lily called after her. In the conference room, Jasmine found Principal Wilson, her father, and several unfamiliar adults seated around a long table. "Jasmine, thank you for coming," Principal Wilson said. "These are members of the school board. They've been reviewing your case." An older woman with kind eyes nodded to Jasmine. "I'm Ms. Washington, head of the board. We've completed our investigation into Mrs. Reynolds, and we've reached some decisions we wanted to share with you first." Jasmine sat down, suddenly nervous. "Am I in trouble?" "Quite the opposite," Ms. Washington assured her. "Your careful documentation helped uncover a pattern that's been going on for years. We've found evidence that Mrs. Reynolds has treated numerous minority students unfairly during her tenure. She's currently on administrative leave," Principal Wilson added, "and will remain so while we determine next steps." Jasmine's father leaned forward. "The board asked for my recommendation as superintendent. Many would expect me to call for immediate termination." Jasmine glanced at him, surprised. Wasn't that what should happen? "But," he continued, "I've proposed a different approach. Mrs. Reynolds' behavior reflects a broader problem, one that firing a single teacher won't solve." Ms. Washington nodded. "Your father has suggested implementing a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all staff across the district. Mrs. Reynolds' case would serve as an anonymized case study." "You mean she keeps her job?" Jasmine asked, unable to hide her shock. "Not in the classroom," Principal Wilson clarified. "If she completes the extensive training and acknowledges her bias, she would be reassigned to curriculum development, where she would have no direct student interaction." "This isn't just about punishment," her father explained gently. "It's about creating lasting change. Every teacher in the district will now receive training on recognizing and addressing bias." Jasmine considered this. Part of her had wanted Mrs. Reynolds simply gone. But would that really solve anything? Or would it just hide the problem? "I think I understand," she said slowly. "Making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else is more important than what happens to one teacher." Ms. Washington smiled. "That's a very mature perspective. There's something else we wanted to discuss with you. Several students have approached Dr. Hernandez about forming a student diversity council. We think it's an excellent idea, and we think you would make an outstanding leader for it." In the weeks that followed, changes rippled through Westfield High. The newly formed Student Diversity Council, with Jasmine, Thomas, Lily, and 12 other students from various backgrounds, created an anonymous reporting system for discrimination concerns. Posters went up in every hallway explaining how to use it. Teachers began attending weekend training sessions, returning with thoughtful discussions about perspectives they'd never considered before. Some were resistant at first, but most engaged openly with the process. Mrs. Reynolds herself remained out of sight, but Jasmine heard she had begun her training sessions and, surprisingly, had become deeply involved in developing new history curriculum materials that included more diverse perspectives. One afternoon, as Jasmine headed to a diversity council meeting, she passed the teachers' lounge and overheard two teachers talking. "The interview committee meets next week," one was saying. "This time, we're using those blind evaluation forms the superintendent suggested." "About time," the other replied. "I can't believe we went so long without examining our hiring practices." Jasmine smiled to herself as she continued down the hall. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a scared new student facing discrimination alone. Now she was helping transform an entire school. That evening at dinner, her father asked how the council meeting had gone. "Really good," Jasmine said, her eyes bright with purpose. "We're working on a peer mentoring program for new students." She paused, then added, "Dad, I think I know what I want to do when I grow up. I want to work in education policy. Like you." He smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "You've already made more change than most people do in a lifetime. I'd said you've got a head start."